In this video, I'll be explaining the 8 different spots that a water heater can leak from. Although number 8 is probably not something you would expect. But before I get to all of that, first let me address the emergency situation. If you're watching this video because your water heater is leaking like crazy, you're freaking out and you don't know what to do, the first thing you should do is turn the water off if you haven't already. If you're not sure where the water shutoff valve is on your water heater, usually it's going to be right above it. If you look on top of your water heater, the 2 pipes coming out of it, if you just trace them, one of them is going to have either a ball valve on it or a spigot that you can use to turn off the water going into the water heater. But if your shutoff valve for your water heater looks like it's 100 years old and if you touch it, it's going to snap off, then you may want to consider turning off the water to your whole house instead. After you turn the water off, the next thing you want to do is turn the power off to the water heater. If you have an electric water heater, go to the circuit breaker panel, find the water heater breaker, and shut that off. If you have a gas water heater, then turn the knob on the gas valve to the off position. Metal expands and contracts with heat, so if your water heater is on and there's a leak somewhere, there's a crack where the water is coming out from, if the water heater is heating up, that crack is going to slightly expand. But if it's off and the water is cooling off, then that crack is going to slightly close instead. In fact, if the leak is small, sometimes people notice that when they turn the water heater off or even turn the temperature on the water heater down, the leak stops. But when they turn the temperature back on, the leak comes back. But anyway, let's get back on track. If your water to the water heater is shut off, the power is turned off, and your water heater is still leaking water, the next thing you want to do is hook up a garden hose to the drain valve and start draining the water heater. To help it drain faster, you may want to open up some hot water faucets around the house. Okay, so hopefully that takes care of the people that are having a really bad day, but for the rest of us, if you came down to your water heater and you notice that there's a little puddle on the floor, does this mean that you're soon getting a brand new water heater, or is this something you can easily fix yourself? Let me show you the 8 different leak spots so you can decide for yourself which path you're going to take. The first leak point that I'm going to cover is the pressure relief valve. That's this little thing right in the middle right here. On my water heater, this valve is right up on top, but on many other water heaters, it's going to be on the side of the water heater instead. So the first place I would check is right around the pressure relief valve where it goes into the water heater. Just kind of feel around there and see if there's anything wet down there. If you're not finding anything wet around it, you know that there's no leak there. And then you also want to see if the valve itself is leaking by following the pipe that is hooked up to it and seeing where it comes out. On my water heater, this thing actually goes outside, but on most water heaters, this pipe is simply directed to the floor 6 inches away from the bottom. Simply touch the outlet of this pipe and see if there's anything wet inside of it. If you're not finding any water here, that means your pressure relief valve is probably not leaking. But if you are finding some water at the end of this pipe, then the best course of action is to replace that pressure relief valve. I have a video where I show you how to replace one of these if you want to see an example of how it's done. But if you're actually finding water on the outside around that valve, then you might be leaking water at the threads where this valve is screwed into the water heater. And I'm going to cover what you can try to do with that a little bit later in the video. Next up is a leaking drain valve. Just like the pressure relief valve, it can be leaking from the valve itself, or it can be leaking around it, where this valve is screwed into the water heater. To check if the drain valve itself is leaking, you can simply stick your finger inside of the valve itself and just spin it around. If your finger is coming out wet, that means there is water leaking through. One really easy thing you can try doing is simply tightening the valve down, either with a screwdriver or if you have a ball valve or a spigot, just tighten that down as hard as you can in the closed position and see if that stops the leak. If tightening it does not stop the leak, then you have 2 choices. 1 is to replace the drain valve, and 2 is to simply throw a cap on here. They sell nice brass caps with a gasket inside of it that you can slide on here, or if you don't want to buy anything, you could simply take a cap off of any bottle, just a standard sized cap. Most of the time, a bottle cap is going to fit perfectly on a drain valve, and it should be enough to seal off the leak. And don't worry, it is okay to do this. There's not going to be any kind of pressure buildup or anything by putting a cap on the drain valve. Number 3 is leaking outlet or inlet pipes. There's been times where people would replace their whole water heater only to find out that the leak was actually in one of these pipes up on top of it, and the water heater itself was totally fine. So you should definitely check the pipes and fittings on top of the water heater to make sure that there's no water leakage anywhere on them. This water heater had a leak recently, and I totally thought it was leaking from here, but it turned out that that was actually not the leak point. But of course that does look terrible, and it will need to be replaced really soon here. This is something you should be able to repair yourself if you're familiar with plumbing. But if you've never done any plumbing work, then I would highly suggest calling out a plumber instead to get that fixed for you. And number 4 is what this water heater's problem was, and that is a leak at the water heating element. I made a video recently where I replaced the heating element on this water heater right here, and that's because this element was leaking at the gasket. The heating element gasket had a little crack in it, and water was slowly leaking by. I decided to just go ahead and replace the whole element, which came with a new gasket. If you want to see how I did that, I'll link that video in the comments. To check if your water heater is leaking at the heating elements, make sure you turn the power off first, and then take the cover panels off and just feel around those heating elements to see if there's any water there. The 5th leak point is at the anode rod. The anode rod is always going to be located on top of the water heater. Sometimes it'll be underneath a cap like this. Other times you're just going to see a big bolt right on top of the water heater. That is your anode rod. Just like the heating element, your leak may be coming where this anode rod screws into the water heater. If you get lucky, your anode rod is going to be readily accessible. It's going to be one big black bolt that you can feel around to make sure that there's no water. But in other cases, like mine right here, my anode rod is underneath this cap and underneath a layer of insulation. So in order to get to it, I would have to dig this insulation up. And on Bradford White water heaters, they actually got even more creative, and they put their anode rod underneath the hot water inlet pipe, which is super annoying. The anode rod is good to check if it's readily accessible, if you have a big black bolt in the middle of your inlet and outlet pipes that you can just feel around to make sure there's nothing wet. But if it's concealed, then for most people it's better to just skip this one. Possible leak point number 6 is the gas valve. If you have a gas water heater, the gas valve actually screws into the water heater, and it's possible that water can leak through those threads. Anytime you have a leak around a component that screws into the water heater, the leak is either caused because that thing is not screwed in tight enough, there's a leak in the gasket, either the gasket is cracked or broken, or the threads on the water heater itself are cracked. And usually, to check any of those points, you are going to need to drain the water heater and take that component out. And before you screw the component back in, take some kind of a brush, preferably a wire brush, and clean out the threads in the water heater. After you do all that, there is one last thing I would do, and that is to put on a nice, healthy layer of Teflon tape around that component. So for example, if we're doing this to a gas valve, I would layer that thing on to make it thick. That way when you're putting it in, if there's any kind of gaps or even if there's a little crack or damage in the threads, that Teflon tape may be able to completely seal that up. But that being said, I do want to point out that layering on the Teflon tape, putting on a new gasket, and screwing down the component tighter only applies if the threads are slightly damaged, but if you're seeing an actual crack in the threads on the water heater itself, then that's considered as a cracked inner tank, and really you should be replacing the whole water heater. Let's move on to number 7, which is condensation. This one is pretty rare, and it only applies to gas water heaters, especially if for some reason you had the temperature set way low, or if you had the water heater off. When you turn it back on, or turn the temperature up, then you might see some condensation on the flue or the exhaust pipe of the water heater. That condensation will then trickle down the flue pipe and end up on the bottom of the tank. Usually condensation issues like this don't happen very often, so what you could do is simply wipe down the floor where it's wet and then come back a day later and see if the water is back there again. If there's no water, then most likely the issue was just condensation. Just keep an eye on your water heater, check it every week or so for the next couple months, and you should be totally fine. But if you want to be on the safe side and make sure that your house never gets flooded, then I would suggest getting a device like this. The one I have right here is only $12 on Amazon. I have a whole video where I show how this thing works, so if you're interested, check it out. And finally, number 9 is a cracked inner tank. If you checked all the other things I listed and you did not find your leak there, that means that most likely what's leaking is actually the inner tank in your water heater. There's either a hole, it's rusted out, or one of the seams have a crack in it. With an electric water heater, you can't really confirm this, but if you have a gas water heater, you should be able to feel the insulation around the burner chamber and see if it's wet or not. If the insulation around that burner chamber is wet, then you for sure know that you have a cracked inner tank. Unfortunately with this one, it is game over. If you have a cracked inner tank, then you simply need a new water heater. But before you write off your water heater, I do have some good news for some of you, which is I skipped number 8. And number 8 is that your water heater is not the problem. I went out to quite a few service calls where the water heater was not even the source of the leak. The water was either coming from the furnace, from the air conditioner, or from the whole house humidifier. But since the water heater is standing right next to the furnace, some of that water that is coming down on the floor goes underneath the water heater, and the homeowner automatically assumes that it's the water heater that's leaking. Some people even go as far as replacing the water heater, only to find out that the leak is still there. So one more thing to check before you condemn the water heater is to look around and make sure that the water is not coming from somewhere else. And the last thing I want to say is that the comments section can sometimes be very helpful as well. So if you have any water heater leak experiences of your own, please share with the rest of us what those were in the comments below. And if you're still here and not yet in the comments section, I have 2 jokes for you. Number 1, what do you call a room full of cynical plumbers? A skeptic tank. And why did the plumber heavily overcharge his customer? Because he had to deal with a whole lot of crap.